Chapter 1 Southern Discomfort Medical Exploitation on the Plantation. David Gavin, 1855. Celia's child, about 4 months old, died last Saturday the 12th. This is 2 Negroes and 3 horses I have lost this year. Frederick Gardiner, a peripatetic Mormon physician, left among his travel memoirs an impression of the 19th century slave markets of Washington, D.C. There are a great number of Negroes, nearly all of whom are slaves, and on different streets are large halls occupied as marts or stores for the sale or purchase of slaves. While I have been looking at one of these places on Graver Street, 2 gentlemen have approached, one of whom I have seen in the saloon. He is a young planter and come to purchase a girl to take care of his children, or whatever duties he may think proper to impose upon her. The other person is a doctor, whom he has brought with him for the purpose of examining her. They say along the front of the row, in company with the agent or salesman. As they move forward, one is called upon to stand up, then another, while a passive examination is made. He discovers a bright mulatto who appears about 16 years of age and is quite good looking. She is ushered into a private room where she is stripped to the nude condition, and a careful examination is made of all her body parts by the doctor, and is pronounced by him to be sound. The money is then paid, and she is transferred to her new owner. I have heard that the masters beat and scorch them most cruelly, but I have not seen anything of the kind, nor do I believe that it occurs very often. For the Southern people, as a class, are noble-minded, kind-hearted people, as can be found in any country. And moreover, it would be against their own interests to brutally treat their slaves, as no planter desires to have sick Negroes on his hands. According to my judgment, so far as my experience extends, I believe that the Negroes as a class are far more humanely treated and taken care of than are the laboring class of European countries. Enslavement could not have existed and certainly could not have been persisted without medical science. However, physicians were also dependent upon slavery, both for economic security and for the enslaved clinical material that fed the American medical research and medical training that bolstered physicians' profession advancement. Gardiner's, I'm pronouncing this man's name wrong, I do not care, suggests the integral role of medicine in enslavement, and repeats a key belief that slave owners and physicians shared an interest in preserving the slave's health, as no planter desired to have a sick Negro on his hands. Although medicine was essential to enslavement, the apparent solicitude for the health of slaves was not all it seemed. Rather, the medical interests of the slaves were often diametrically opposed to the interests of the owner and of American physicians. For the first antagonist regime between African Americans and their physicians. Between 17th century advent of African enslavers to North America and the end of the 19th century, the slave and the physician shared an unrecognizable primitive medical world. The germ theory that revealed the microbial nature of much disease and led to the first grand wave of disease cures was still well in the future. The existence of pathogens such as bacteria, virus, and fungi was unsuspected, although no effective treatments existed for prevalent diseases until the 18th century. Until the late 1830s, the lack of effective anesthesia made the few common surgical procedures horribly painful and all others impossible. Between the 17th and 19th centuries, medicine in the United States reflected a narrowly limited understanding of disease and rather curtsy training of medical practitioners. Public health institutions were few, feeble, ephemeral, rising momentarily with epidemics of yellow fever or smallpox and subsiding from neglect after the crisis resolved. Even the simplest public health measures, washing hands and antiseptic treatments, clean water, sound, pathogen-free housing, and untainted food supply, sewage management, and disease reporting were all in the future. Because there were only a few effective disease therapies and no antibiotics, epidemics of yellow fever, malaria, tuberculosis, and other infectious diseases frequently raged unchecked. In the early 1700s, this mirrored the situation in England and the rest of Europe. But medicine on the continent began to undergo modern changes, although these were very slow to cross the Atlantic. Europe began to embrace public health measures and medical advances such as widespread vaccination, scientific medical education, and the rise of the hospital. But America progress lagged behind, especially in the South. The point of this chapter's unflattering precinct of Nassen, American medicine, is not to castigate it for its primitiveness, but to put Black historical aversion to medical care into context. For most antebellum Blacks were subjected to Southern medicine. The South was a particularly unhealthy region and was home to 90% of American Blacks, the majority of whom were enslaved until 1865. The first Blacks arrived in the colonies in 1619, and by 1700 there were only about 20,000 Blacks. But as the slave trade flourished, 20,000 more Blacks arrived every year. Although 30% of transported slaves died in the nightmare of the Middle Passage, there were 550,000 chattel slaves in the United States by 1776, when Blacks constituted 20% of the U.S. population. By 1807, slave importation was legally prohibited throughout the country, and by 1860, the nation's 4 million enslaved Blacks had a value equivalent to $4 billion today. In some states, the Black population completely comprised slaves. Alabama, for example, forbid the presence of free Blacks. Doesn't make sense. The South was the nadir of the American medical experience, visited by a deadly triple confluence: the pathogens of North America, Europe, and Africa. This unholy trinity yielded a bewildering array of unfamiliar infectious diseases such as hookworm, types of malaria, and yellow fever, incubated by a subtropical climate that was hospitable year-round to pathogens that could not thrive in the colder north. Even familiar European illnesses flared anew in strange forms, abetted by the hot, marshy climate, poor sanitation, and a public health vacuum. Although the South harbored a highly visible affluent class, the region's relative poverty led to a dearth of medical care, and a host of unrecognized nutritional deficiency diseases. So did enslavement. A dramatically misunderstood set of diseases led to the adaptation of heroic remedies calculated to kill or cure. Through the 18th century, Western medicine was not only misinformed but dangerously so. Caustic medicines of the period often contained metabolic poisons such as arsenic or calomel, a compound of mercury and chlorine that was used as a purgative. Many other remedies contain highly toxic substances such as mercury and additive Schedule II narcotics, including opium, morphine, as well as cocaine derivatives. These medicines addicted, sickening, or killed outright. They also could trigger chemical pneumonias or progressive lung injury. If inhaled during a bout of iatrogenic or physician-triggered vomiting. No studies seem to have been done on this point, but such lung injuries may have helped to account for slaves' higher death rate for respiratory disease. Induced vomiting was an everyday event because the common denominator of medical techniques in this period was the violent release of bodily fluids. Copious bleeding, blistering, and the inductive of violent diarrhea were standard theories. Harsh laxatives such as calomel or jalap produce copious diarrhea, which leach nutrients, water, and electrolytes from the body. They also invited painful bed sores, which were open to infectious unchallenged by antibiotics. These crude therapies were not only unpleasant, but debilitating to ill persons and even to the strong and healthy. Arsenic, for example, produced not only the intended vomiting and diarrhea, but also a wide range of other problems, including fainting, heart disease, disorders of the nervous system, gangrene, and cancers. Mercury's very serious effects included injury to the nervous system, profound mental deficiency, hair and tooth loss, kidney and heart disease, lung injury, and respiratory distress. Mercury crossed the placental barrier and concentrated in breast milk, contributing to the high black infant death and birth defect rates. Such ministries were often fatal. Monstrosities were often fatal. In 1799, death of George Washington, hastened by a copious blood lead the debilitated former president could ill afford, is perhaps the best known example of a patient finished off by the misguided heroics of 18th century medicine. However, whites of the slave-owning class enjoyed better initial health, better nutrition, and less exposure to environmental pathogens and parasites than did enslaved blacks. Slave owners did not suffer from overwork and exposure, so they were better able than slaves to withstand the rigors of bloodletting. Sensing this, many physicians and scientists discouraged bloodletting for slaves. Thomas Jefferson, statesman and amateur physician-scientist, wrote unequivocally, "Never bleed a Negro." But in their everyday practices, physicians didn't listen. Dr. Lunsford Yangler wrote on March 16, 1833, "I was called before sunrise to visit a Negro woman. I took from her 12 ounces of blood. I waited about 15 minutes when she had a severe convulsion. Such techniques as cupping, the use of heat glass jars to create a partial vacuum that drew blood upright to the skin surface and through the incision of the cut, trepanation, the therapeutic drilling of holes in the skull, were risky for pampered, well-nourished adults living in relatively healthy environments. But they were fatal attentions for sickly, undernourished, and exhausted slaves and for their children, who were at even higher risk of succumbing to anemia or dehydration. Enslaved African Americans were more vulnerable than whites to respiratory infections. Thanks to poorly constructed slave shacks that admitted winter cold and summer heat, slaves' immune systems were unfamiliar with or native to microbiomes that cause various pneumonias and tuberculosis. Parasitic infections and abysmal nutrition also undermined blacks' immunological rigor. Before antibiotics and sterile technique, surgery was often a fatal affair. Unaware of the connection between bacteria and infection, surgeons operated in their street clothes and with dirty hands in filthy environments, such as the shack that served as slave hospitals. Even minor incisions or injuries could proceed to life-threatening infections with frightening rapidity. Part 3. Southern medicine of the 18th and early 19th centuries was harsh, ineffective, and experimental by nature. Physicians' memoirs, medical journals, and planters' records all reveal that enslaved Black Americans bore the worst abuses of these crudely empirical practices, which countenanced a hazardous degree of ad hoc experimentation in medications, dosages, and even spontaneous surgical experimentation in the daily practices among slaves. Physicians were active participants in the exploitation of African American bodies. The records reveal that slaves were both medically neglected and abused because they were powerless and legally invisible. The courts were almost completely uninterested in the safety and health rights of the enslaved. The practice of hiring slaves often further endangered enslaved workers by removing such of an employer's incentive to keep the slave healthy and safe. Some humane plantation owners were careful to choose less risky work ventures, but a great danger of slave death or disability was inherent in some form of mining, tobacco production, rice farming, and most plantation work. In these settings, the slave's possible death became part of his owner's commercial calculations. Ominously for blacks, the owner, not the enslaved workers, determined safety and rationed medical care, deciding when and what type of care was to be given. Because professional attention was expensive, most owners dosed their own slaves as long as they could before calling in physicians, who usually saw slaves only in extremes as a last resort. In clinical notes, the medical journals, and memoirs, physicians consistently decried the planters' tendency to rely upon the cheaper monstrosities of overseers, slaves, and mistresses in order to save expense. Physicians' records also express disgust at the condition in which enslaved workers were kept. Historian Richard Skyrock observed in 1936, of all critiques, the Southern physician was perhaps in the best position to report on the physical and moral treatment of the slaves, when he stated that he sometimes did, that Negroes were overworked and underfed. He can hardly be suspected of anti-slavery bias, since he was the friend of the planter who employed him. As a matter of fact, he usually approved of the institution. Planters' own records and slave narratives corroborate physicians' complaints that planters provided professional medical care only when they deemed it necessary to save the slave's life, often too late. Owners also restricted access to medical care by routinely accusing sick blacks of malingering. Slave narratives and planter records revealed that an owner faced with a sick slave was likely to believe the illness was feigned. In her excellent and nuanced history, Working Cures, Healing, Health, and Power on Southern Slave Plantation, Charla Fett described how, in 1859, slave owner William Mice, again, I'm not going to pronounce these names right, resentfully recorded that his 80-year-old slave Patty had just died of I know not what disease. She had been saying she was sick for near a year and always pretended to be sick. No doctor was summoned to investigate, nor even Patty's death seemed to have exonerated her from charges of malengineering. The enfeebled Patty was no longer valuable in the fields or as a breeder, so the nature of her sickness was inconsequential. Part 5. Owners relied upon doctors to tell them whether slaves were malingering, but physicians were less than objective. Dr. W. H. Taylor called in consultation for an enslaved man, prefaced his assessment with the phrase, remembering that simulation was a characteristic of his race. Doctors and owners wrote articles in which they shared medical russes and techniques calculated to get blacks, healthy or not, back into the fields. Dr. M.H. Malcloud even wrote his master's thesis on the fraudulent illnesses of slaves. He shared an incident in which he had accidentally administered an overdosage of ammonium carbonate, a corrosive white powder that was often used as smelling salts, to a slave shamming an epileptic fit. The burning sensation shocked her into abandoning her performance, and McLeod, like many other doctors, began to advocate such vile medical violence was confronted with questionable illness in slaves. But masters also responded to suspected malingering or prolonged illness with frank abuse. Thomas Chaplin wrote in his planter's journal, "Mary came out of the sick house today, or rather was whipped out." Owners and physicians also blurred the therapeutic line by referring jostling to whipping as medicine for malingering slaves. One complaining woman was treated with a skin hide or hickory switch to scorch her. Emphasis added. Other doctors recommended that an owner apply 9 drops of essence of rawhide or oil of hickory to the back of the slave. Ways to say beat them. Yet slave narratives occasionally speak of the kindness of the sympathetic white physician. In the 1930s, former Texas slave Wes Bradley told WPA interviewers how the old white doctor that tended to us helped them get out of work. He took a little flour and meal and water and made pills. The doctor then told the master that the slave was too sick to work. Sometimes they stayed in bed 3 or 4 days taking flour pills. But most physicians shared the economic and political interests of slave owners and conspired with planters, their real clients, to subjugate slaves by invading their bodies. Former slave Martha Griffith Brown recalled that the kindly wife of Dr. Mlandy, who sometimes was called in by her master, did not believe in slavery, yet she dared not speak against it. Against the particular institution of the South. It would injure the doctor's practice, a matter about which she must be careful. The belief in the eternal malingering of slaves was only one tenet of scientific racism, a wide body of mostly unflattering beliefs that the bodies and minds of people of African descent. These beliefs were presented as research findings, explained by scientific theories, and promulgated by whites who were sympathetic to or were actively profiting from the institution of enslavement. So, not surprisingly, scientific racism provided medical and scientific justification for slavery. Southern scientists claimed that they alone could analyze blacks with authority. After all, they lived in proximity to blacks, had studied them, and understood their medical and intellectual characteristics. Northern scientists tended not to study African Americans because they were less important to the Northern economy, which was not directly based upon chattel slavery. The care and treatment of slaves was an important aspect of Southern medical regionalism, and the lack of attention to Negro medicine became an interesting, bitter source of contention between Northern and Southern medical schools. As a result, Southerners urged their medical students to escrow the schools of the North, and when tensions mounted on the eve of the Civil War, Southern students in Northern medical schools were holding rallies in which they voted to return South en masse. In Philadelphia alone, 200 Southern medical students withdrew from Jefferson College, and another 100 withdrew from the University of Pennsylvania during a single academic year between 1859 and 1860. Part 6. Despite their claims of unique expertise, the shoddy research that Southern physicians conducted into black health consisted of an untested nucleus of mythology about the biblical nature of blacks, negative reactions to blacks' appearance, historical writings, racial descriptions from antiquated natural scientists, endless and largely fictional catalogs of racial traits, and biblical interpretations all provided a framework for scientific and medical theories about blacks. So did a blame the victim approach to the poor health of the enslaved. The scientific racist emphasis was not upon fact-based theories, logical methodologies, experimental data, control groups, and verification by replication. There was neither checks against accepting assumptions as fact, nor any test for confounding social factors. There certainly was no provision for removing ethnocentric bias. This science was the embodiment of ethnocentric bias. This science also serves a critical political purpose, for it provided a biological and ethical rationale for enslavement. Historical documents reveal that African Americans recognized this hazardous medical agenda and resisted when they could. Thus, medical abuse fed iotrophobia, the fear and loathing of many Black Americans harbor to this day toward the American medical establishment. An exegesis of American medical literature compiled in the service of scientific racism is beyond the scope of this book and has been ably completed elsewhere. However, a description of the most pertinent belief will help to illuminate the atmosphere in which blacks were medically abused and in which they learned to be weary of the precepts of practices of American medicine. The science of race has always been an amalgam of logic and culture. The nature of race itself is an important but dubious and shifting facet of scientific medical thought. As early as AD 160, the Roman physician Galen, from 129 to 199, described African men as possessing oversized sexual organs and inferior intelligence. But until the 17th century, the changing meaning of race had encompassed only nations and families. Race in the singular also denoted all of mankind, as in the race of man. Use of the term race to denote biological different types of mankind evolved only in the 18th century, when the study of animal breeding gave rise to heightened awareness of animal subspecies and the possibility of breeding animals to encourage desired traits. Not coincidentally, this period coincides with the growth of the slave trade, when the biological distinctiveness of men became economically important. Those who studied the different groups of men were called ethnogenologists and were the forerunners of anthropologists. Ethologicists appealed the classification and categorization methods of the natural sciences, called taxonomy the study of man. Even after the meaning of race came to include subgroupings of man, it had several meanings. By race, some meant biological subspecies of man, analogous to the different breeds of dogs. For example, Swedish naturalist Carl von Plankton, the most famous of the taxonomists, categorized Africans and by extension U.S. blacks as Homo afer, theorizing that black men had different evolutionary forebears and had evolved along a separate evolutionary track from white men. In 1735, the first edition of his Systema Naturae also designated the subsections Homo sapien americanus for Native Americans, whom he described as ruled by superstition, Homo sapiens Asiaticus for Asians, whom he believed were ruled by ritual, and Homo sapien Europaeus for whites, who were ruled by intelligence. But in Linnaeus' study system, Homo sapiens afer were ruled by caprice. This use of the word race in the sense of biological distinct subset of Homo sapiens was popularized in 1749 by Georges Louis Lecomte de Fleu, a wealthy French intellectual who made important contributions to medicine and natural history. Blefin notably theorized that the resemblance between apes and humans hinted at common ancestry. For other theorists, race indicated entirely different species of men, with different origins as well as different characteristics for blacks and whites. Those who believed in this theory were the Paleogenists, Still, others believe that whites and blacks shared a common ancestral ape and a singular species. These were the monogenists. Most monogenists believe that whites and blacks were originally and inherently equal, but that blacks had suffered from environmental and social pressures that caused them to become inferior. Other monogenists believe that blacks devotion had imparted partial inferiority, although they shared a species designated with whites. Throughout the 17th century and into the early 18th century, the theories of scientific racism were informed by the Bible as well as by science. Monogenists, for example, held that people of every race had originated from the biblical Adam and Eve. Gradually, blacks had taken on divergent characteristics such as darkened skin, woolly hair, pronounced features dictated by the African climate. The idea that blacks' features were dictated by climate was already widespread. Shakespeare's Cleopatra, for example, is described as burnt black by Phoebus' amorous kisses. Monogenists believe that blacks' features were inferior to those of white man, but they also believe that they were malleable and that blacks could catch up to Caucasians. By the end, it was scientific belief that provided malleable, and by the late 1830s, they bent to accommodate the political reality of abolishment. Black and white abolitionists were turning world and domestic opinion against enslavement as inhumane, unjust, and unchristian, and pro-slavery physician scientists, I'm going to mess up every single one of these names, such as Joseph Clark Knott, Samuel Jacques Mort, Louis Dutlep, and George Robbins, leaders of the American School of Ethnology, went on the defensive. They responded by portraying the enslaved blacks as inherently debased and immutably so. No amount of training, education, or good treatment can make him equal of the white man. According to the polygenists, blacks were physically inferior, were liars, malingerers, hypersexual, and indolent. In the early years of the 18th century, blacks were most often compared to beasts. Later in this century, comparison to European children reigned interest. Children who could never grow up, and the slave became Peter Pan in blackface. The suspected lack of adult judgment rendered blacks unable to care for themselves and gave yet another justification for slavery. It also is important to trace the tangled distinctions between racism and racialism. Racists believe in an innate, usually immutable inferiority, but racialist is a confusing label because it is applied to people holding very different beliefs. The term can denote a person who believes that race or color does signal inherent attributes, but that the attributes in question are simply different, neither negative or inferior. But racialist can also mean a person who interprets the different features and qualities of blacks as superior. The word racialist has recently been used to describe actions taken to redress the long-standing racial wrongs, such as affirmative action to bolster the fortunes of blacks. Then again, racialist can also be a mere synonym for racism, as it long was used in England, and it had been adapted by racial hatred groups as the same as racism. As a result of this Semantic confusion. A once useful term has been rendered worthless by its many contradictory meanings. The awkward and palate terms race-based seems to the closest thing we now have to the neutral racial adjective. Whatever their pet theory, the many physical differences between blacks and whites suggest a hierarchy of humanity to scientific races. Different from whites meant inferior, and inferiority was documented in entire catalogs of black flaws that filled medical journals and textbooks. In 1839, Morton published Carina Americana, a book written to demonstrate how human skull measurements indicate a hierarchy of racial types. Morton determined that Caucasians had the largest skulls and therefore the largest brains, and blacks the smallest. His tests were the forerunner of phrenology, which sought to determine character and intelligence by interpreting the shape of the skull. In 1848, Louisiana's Samuel Cartwell Mundy had renowned by publishing a plethora of articles of Negro medicine in the Southern medical journals, leading the Medical Association of Louisiana to appoint him to chair of its committee to investigate black health and physiology. That same year, Cartwright published the paper, The Diseases and Physical Peculiarities of the Negro Race. Cartwright augmented his scholarly work with the constant onslaught of medical-based pro-slavery letters to newspapers and popular magazines. He supported his widely read claims of black inferiority with a mixture of biblical lore and scientific theories that was not unusual for his time. Cartwright suggested that blacks' physical and mental defects made it impossible for them to survive without white supervision and care, alleging that the cranium of blacks was 10% smaller than that of the whites, preventing full development of the brain and causing a stunting of the intellect. French scientist Louis Pleuret added that in the Negro, the cranium closes on the brain like a prison. It is no longer a temple divine. It is no longer a temple divine. The use of expression of blah 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 by a sort of helmet for resisting heavy blows. Cartwright even asserted that blacks had a very different breathing apparatus and skeletal structure than of whites. By 1851, Cartwright had also discovered and described a host of imaginary black diseases, which principal symptoms seemed to be a lack of enthusiasm for slavery. Escape might have been seemed normal behavior for a slave in ancient Greece or Rome, but Cartwright medical condoned such behavior in American blacks, offering a diagnosis of draptonium, from the Greek word for flight and insanity. Hebetude was a singular laziness or shiftiness that caused slaves to mishandle and abuse their owner's property. Dystia ichthypique was another black behavioral malady, which was characterized by a desire to destroy the property of white slaves owners. Cartwright claimed that it differs from every other species of mental disease, and it is accommodated with physical signs or lesions on the body discoverable to the medical observer. Struma africana was a form of tuberculosis that physicians misdiagnosed as a particularly African disease. Casaceus africana referred to blacks' supposed propensity for eating non-food substances such as clay, chalk, and dirt, although this disorder, which is called pica today, is not racially specific, and the cravings it inspired were probably related to the rampant malnourishment among slaves. Telling Dr. Cartwright recommended that these ailments were treated with corporal punishment or with internment in work camps. But the patient in some put the patient in some kind of hard work in the open air and sunshine. The compulsory power of the white man by making the slothful Negro take active exercise puts in active play the lungs. Through these agencies, the vitalized blood is seen to the brain to give liberty to the brain. Other medical disorders were thought to manifest differently, usually less severely in blacks. Syphilis, for example, was held to be racially dimorphic. Physicians believed it worked its most feared damage within the neurological systems of whites, but that the least evolved nervous systems of blacks was left relatively unimpaired. In blacks, syphilis was thought to attack the muscles, including the heart. This belief that syphilis in blacks differed dramatically from the disease in whites provided a rationale for the infamous U.S. Public Health Service's Tuskegee study of syphilis in the untreated Negro male. Between 1932 and 1972, 600 black men, their wives, and their children were deceived into participating in a research study that denied them treatment, so that the PHS, the U.S. Public Health Service, scientists could trace the progress of the disease in blacks. In an 1850 paper, Cartwright insisted that whites and blacks differed so dramatically that the medical treatment which would benefit or cure a white man would often injure or kill a Negro. This universal belief in uniquely black diseases led doctors and planters to clamor for a textbook on the medical care of blacks. But such a book was not written until almost a century later. When it appeared in 1942, it was no paean to white superiority, but rather was entitled The Biology of the Negro, a text edited by African-American physician Julian Herman Lewis. It was followed in 1975 by the masterwork textbook of black-related diseases by Richard Allen Williams, M.D. Alleged inferior cognition was only the tip of the iceberg. In 1854, several years after Cartwright published Report of the Diseases and Physician Peculiarities of the Negro Race, and 5 years before Darwin published On the Origin of Species, Mobile, Alabama physician Hosanno, M.D., and George Lapidette provided an equally popular screed entitled Types of Mankind. In it, they claimed that black physical and mental differences signaled their polygenic origins and proved black inferiority. For example, Knott theorized that the distinctive knee joint and long heel on the black man proved that he had been created as a submissive knee bender, a servant to whites. Scientists adjudged the dark skin of Africans as a biblical curse that set them aside as eternal slaves to other men. Black Americans were taught as a race that the biological identical Black Americans were Black Americans were thought of as a race that was biologically identical to the African race, and there originally was the logic to this. Between 20% of slaves were still native Africans in 1780, although that number dropped by only 10% by 1830. A few decades after slave importation officially stopped, mulattoes, the progeny of black-white mating, were considered to be a separate race. According to the ethnologics of the American school, black features marked them as a different species. Large buttocks and genitals that indicated hypersexuality, a head covering that was not hair but synonymous to the wool of livestock, the size of a skull determined by painstaking but rigid measurements, the facial angles of blacks, and thick lips that testify to their ape-like nature, has scientists of the era more correctly noted that apes and chipmunks have the thinnest of all lips. They doubtless would have ignored that feature before they credited blacks with such an evolutionary advance. She's saying that that chimpanzees and apes and monkeys have the thinnest lips and also white skin and straight hair. Physicians discovered many imaginary physical differences in blacks, such as fingernails, a distinctive topography of the breast, elongated penises, disproportionately large hands and feet, distended labia, and clitori, all of which provided scientific racists with ample evidence of black biological primitiveness. In fact, few anatomical sites escaped persistent labeling as definite indicators of black inferiority. As late as 1903, Dr. W.T. English observed, "A careful inspection reveals the body of the Negro, a mass of imperfections from the crown of the head to the soles of the feet. Even biological advances were cast as racial flaws. In discussing the tendency of blacks to survive yellow fever epidemics than that of whites, one physician denounced the inferior susceptibility of black slaves." So, even with biological advances such as surviving the yellow fever epidemic that killed whites, black slaves were still seen as inferior. This portion is called insidious immunities. The belief in separated evolved species also held the persons of one race could not survive in the climate designed for another. Whites who tried to live and work in West Africa, a climate designed for blacks, died in droves, earning it a sequential white man's grave. When the 19th century death rate for British soldiers ranged between 483 to 668 per 1,000 soldiers in Africa, compared to the general annual death rate of 15 per 1,000. Historian Warwick Anderson, MD, described how the U.S. military sought to exploit the natural infirmity of black Americans for the tropics. In 1900, Nathaniel Gateway Salyer, the dean of Harvard's Lawrence Scientific School, proposed that the troops which are required for federal service in tropical lands might well be recruited from the Negroes. Salyer was convinced that such children of the tropics would make excellent soldiers, at least as infirmity men. Because the African American constitutes were preempted for the tropical disease environment. But in the Philippines, Schuyler's distinguished advice was already redundant. During the previous 2 years, the United States had been using African American and Filipino scouts to suppress the resistance to its occupation. Physicians claimed that whites could never work in Africa or in the subtropical environment, such as the U.S. South. The Southern landowner class, calling physicians, paid attention because they equated disease with sinister climate and were confronted with the oppressive, hot, and humid, malarious environment that they believed to be teemed with yellow fever, smallpox, typhoid, diphtheria, and cholera. Goodness gracious. They were also faced with fertile lands that required backbreaking labor with attentive risk of heat, perversion, sunstroke, and paralysis infection. An immune population specifically designed by the Creator to work long, hard, and for free as subservient knee benders was the perfect answer to this dilemma. In mid-century, Samuel A. Cartwright and his medical brethren, such as Charles Lethbrook, belabored the immunities to malaria and yellow fever they claimed blacks exhibited. But to fully justify enslavement, scientists such as Knott had to turn from their naturalist texts to their Bibles, from which they deduced that blacks were the children of Ham, son of Noah, who, along with his progenies, was marked and condemned to be a servant to his brother for having viewed his father's nakedness. Other similar biblical justifications were found, and Knott even ventured onto a twisted ethical high road when he invested that yellow fever, malaria were visited upon whites as divine punishment for not enslaving blacks. He insisted that non-slave holding whites conducted these diseases because as the result of usurping the natural black role as laborers in the field. Pragmatic planters and politicians ignored the religious moralizing but embraced the useful fact that black slaves were the only logical medical choice for backbreaking labor in their sunny fields. The amenities in question were usually partial and sometimes imaginary. Planters' own records bear the best evidence that blacks' immunities to heat perversion were merely a conventional myth. One Virginia owner observed, enslaver, in 1825, hottest day ever. Men gave out and some fainted. The 1851 journalist of K. Washington Skinner, overseer on the Gower plantation, noted, on Monday, Lascotty and Sari received a stroke of the sun. Many of the other Negroes staggered about considerably. Blacks were supposed to be immune to malaria, but such immunities is complex and was poorly understood before 1900. Malaria denotes a group of lingering infectious diseases marked by long cycles in which waves of utter debilitating alternative which periods of better health. These periodical relapses can end in death, perhaps upon the strain of malaria and the immunization rigor of the sufferer. The disease is spread by parasites infected by the bite of the female mosquito, and the time it was widespread outside of New England at the time, especially throughout the South. However, 18th and 19th century Southern physicians did not understand that malaria, which they called intermittent fever, remittent fevers, fevers in argue, and quotation fever, actually has 3 different strands with differing causes, symptoms, and prognosis. Falciparum and vivax malaria are the most common North American strands.
Another strand, malariae, is so rare and so similar to vivax that scientists tend to consider them a singular entity. Vivax/malaria, which antebellum physicians call Turanian fever, causes racking symptoms of high fever, chills, headache, icy bone pain, anemia, sweating, profuse sweating, and exhaustion, many of which recur at 48-hour intervals. It can become chronic and last for years, but it kills only 5% of its victims. Falciparum malaria ends more quickly, but it is much more severe and can cause a stroke by compromising the blood flow to the brain and kidneys. 40% of its victims die. In 1826, Dr. Philip Tidwig wrote, "Intermittent fever, so hostile to constitute of the white inhabitants, has no terror for the Negro, who, when attacked, requires but little medicine to rid of his insidious enemy and to secure him against a return." However, planters' records and physicians' journals are full of accounts of slaves laid low with or dying of malaria. It was an extremely common complaint, one that coincided coincidentally with harvest times in the late summer or early fall. So it was a serious monetary concern for planters who were willing to expend money on physicians to get their malaria-stricken slaves back into the field as soon as possible. Scientists were wrong in posting Africans' innate absolute resistance to malaria, and they were equally wrong in suggesting that whites could mount no immunity. Anyone, black or white, who grows up in a malarious environment and survives repeated infections and bounds with falciparum comes to live in an uneasy truce with the parasite, becoming not quite well, but not acutely ill. This state of immunological compromise misled planters into thinking that these slaves were unaffected when they were exposed to malaria and did not die. Such immunity is temporary, lasting only as long as one remains continuously exposed to the parasite. Planters and physicians knew this and deliberately cultivated local malaria immunity in their newly arrived slaves by seasoning or allowing them to be bitten by area mosquitoes, thus infecting them with local strain. Whites underwent seasoning as well. However, one type of malaria immunity is racially described in the United States. 95% of sub-Saharan Africans and approximately 70% of African Americans are Duffy negative. This means that they lack the Duffy antigens, without which Vivax cannot penetrate red blood cells and cause illness. People of any ethnic group who have sickle cell trait also enjoy a partial protection against deadly malaria. So do people with one gene for the related blood disease or hemoglobin S and hemoglobin C. These are not black immunities. They also protect Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, and Asian people. Interestingly, the contradiction of the black slave as both riddled with imperfections from head to toe, as a hardy laborer who was impervious to most illness, escaped the scientific races. Scientists expressed whichever opinion fit their political need at that moment. As abolitionist Frederick Douglass suggests when he observed that 99 of 100 polygenists were Anglo-Saxon slave owners. Scientists also claim that the primitive nervous system of blacks were immune to physical and emotional pain and to mental illness. This belief, which will be discussed at greater length in the next chapter, releases physicians and owners from the responsibility of shielding blacks from painful medical procedures and justified torture such as branding, whipping, hobbling, and maiming. All these precepts of scientific racism, although convenient for the slave owner and physician, were highly illogical articles of faith. So was the supposed inferior intelligence of blacks. Because planters and doctors behaved in many contexts as though they held the abilities and judgment of blacks in high regard, employing slaves in responsible positions as nurses, cooks, herbalists, midwives, overseers, leaders of work gang, accountants, and operatives of farm and factory implements. Owners reaped benefits from the many patents on slave inventions, and physicians used slaves as skilled apprentices who often went on to practice independently. White households depended upon the specialized skills and discernment of slaves, not the other way around. In descriptions of runaways, published as newspaper advertisements, as master's financial investments necessitated an honest description of his vanished slave. These are replete with references to artful, well-spoken, crafty, and intelligent slaves who typically absconded in well-organized groups, often with a light-skinned confederate who posed as their owner until they reached freedom. Advertisements referred to some slaves not only as literate, but polyglots, fluent in French, German, and Dutch. Some were refined violinists and disclaimers. Others practiced professions such as doctor or dentist. The master's plaintiff wondered that an apparently docile slave could have given him the slip is a commonplace of these advertisements. They dearly held precepts of scientific racism sound nakedly racist, absurd, or both today. But in 18th and 19th centuries, scientific racism was simply science, and it was promulgated by the very best minds at the most prestigious institutions of the nation. That should be in quotes. Other, more logical medical theorists suggested the equalities of Africans and laid poor black health at the feet of their abusers. But these never entertained the appeal of the medical philosophy that justifies slavery, and along with it, our nation's profitable ways of life. Dr. Garner, whose slave market narrative opened his chapter, spoke from many when he claimed that slave owners must have jealously guarded their slaves' health, coddled them to protect their own economic interests. In the Washington slave pen, Gardner witnessed the physician in his role of pronouncing a slave to be sound, yet he confused the physician's certification of the slave's soundness with concern for her health. Soundness did not speak for her well-being or happiness, but rather to the ability to extract work from her, the likelihood of fetching a good price on the market, and her breeding ability. Many common medical problems, from medical illness to chronic malaria and parasitic infection, were compatible with the demands of an enslaved laborer's work. In fact, many ailments emanated from these workplaces. Profit drove the medical treatment of slaves from their very first encounters with Western medicine. Kidnapped Africans en route to the Americas were cursorily examined by ship's surgeons in the attempt to cut losses by immediate gesture. Those with such stigma of webbed bottom sign, swelling of the lymph nodes found in those who harbored trypanosomiasis, or sleeping sickness. They and others who would not survive the horrific Atlantic journey were unceremoniously thrown overboard. Southern physicians engaged in a bustling soundness practice by guaranteeing the fitness for work of slaves who were to be bought and sold. Doctors charged as much or more for their service as they did for standard disease treatments. A simple pronouncement of health, for example, could cost anywhere from $2 to $10 in 1850s Virginia, but such assessments were sometimes challenged when the slave died or became incompatible soon after having been pronounced sound. Expert physicians' testimony commented as much as $50, a very steep one-day fee for the times. Thus, testifying to soundness in court became an important and lucrative part of medical practice in 1858. Dr. Juror Washington of Savannah Medical College declared the need for a manual that cataloged the chronic and debilitating diseases that rendered blacks unsound for work. He then candidly supplied the manual himself. Among the Dale-breaking alignments, it cited where loss of limbs, cancer, asthma, injury to muscles, scars, and syphilis. How was this interest in fitness for work or soundness at odds with slave health? With the soundness rather than the welfare of the slave in mind, for example, slaves were not immune against smallpox as whites were, because they might leave marks on their bodies that could discourage fires. The memoirs of William Wells Brown, originally a slave and later a doctor, recount how the graying hair and beards of aging slaves were blackened on the auction board. They were subsequently purchased by buyers who expected the toll of a young man. The blacks countered with ruses of their own. As slavery apologist Edward A. Pollard illustrated in 1859, Noe, on mounting the steps to the auction block, had assumed a mostly drooped aspect, hanging his head and affecting the feebleness of old age. He had probably hoped to have avoided a sale by such a dodge. Former slave Bethany Benet recalled in her memoir, I had been told by an old Negro woman certain tricks that I could resort to, when placed upon the stand, that would be likely to hinder my sale. And when the doctor who was employed to examine the slaves on such occasions told me to let him see my tongue, he found it coated and feverish, and turned from me with a shiver of disgust. Said he was obliged to admit that at that moment I was a very billish condition. Benet did not disclose the specific advice the old woman shared, but many common therapists of her day, such as the emetic calomel, dramatically inflamed the tongue, gums, and salivatory glands. Benin continued. One after another of the crowd felt on my limbs, and asked me all manner of questions, to which I replied in the ugliest manner I dared. And when the auctioneer raised his hammer and cried, How much do I hear for this woman? The bids were so low, I was ordered down from the stand. And Eliza, a beautiful woman, was called upon in my place. Poor thing, there were more eager bids for her. For such as she, the demands of slavery were insatiable. Soundness for women, and sometimes for men, was tied to sexual attractiveness and reproductive ability. Thomas Jefferson declared, I consider a slave woman who breeds once every 2 years as profitable as the best worker on the farm. Every year, from 1750 until emancipation, one of every 5 black women of childbearing age, between the ages 15 and 45, gave birth. Girls were forced or enticed into sexual relationship at an unhealthy early age by owners who cited the girl's supposed hot-blooded African nature. Sexual transmitted diseases thrived on the plantation, notably syphilis, against which the immunologically native Africans had little protection. Enslaved women's vulnerability began on the sea passage from Africa, as recorded in 1788 memoirs of English ship's surgeon Alexander Fabrorson. On board some ships, the common sailors are allowed to have intercourse with such of the black women whose consent they can procure. Though officers are permitted to indulge their passions among them at pleasure, and sometimes are guilty of such excess as disgrace human nature. But whites ascribed black women's sexual availability not to their powerlessness, but to a key tenet of scientific racism. Blacks were unable to control their powerful sexual drives, which were frequently compared to those of running animals. This lack of control made black men dangerous and made black women sexually aggressive Jezebels who habitually enticed white men into inappropriate sexual relationships. Dr. Louis Kiss My Ass, the famous Harvard, explained. As soon as the sexual desires are awakened in the young men of the South, they find it easy to gratify themselves by the readiness with which they are met by colored, mixed-race house servants. this blunts his better instinct in that the direction and leads him gradually to seek more spicy partners, as I have heard the full blacks called by fast young men. This theory did not allocate any responsibility to the master as the owner of the women and the person who decided when and with whom she would have sexual relations. But slave narratives bemoaned the rape and sexual abuse that threatened a black woman at every turn. Mary Reynolds, who was born on the plantation of Dr. Kilham in Black River, Louisiana, reflected, quote, us niggers known the doctor took a black woman quick as he did a white, and took any of his place he wanted, and he took them often. As the personal property of the master, black women had no social or legal protection. They could not legally be raped. Even consensual relationships had to be viewed through the lens of enslavement. In her memoir, former slave Harriet Jacobs sadly muses that she eventually accosted to such sexual demands because it was less humiliating to give than to be forced. Once pregnant, women typically were kept at hard labor until their 5th month, and recalcitrant pregnant women were made to lay in trenches that accompanied their bellies so that they could be beaten without harming the unborn child. Soundness consideration also dictated levels of care, which varied according to a slave's value. Slaves who were strong, young, and valuable received a quality of care that was denied to the feeble, as well as the aged, who were often cast off the plantation or sold to physicians when the extent of their care exceeded their market value. Former slave Martha Griffer Brown recalled the words in which an abusive master refused to pay a doctor to treat an elderly slave who had spent her life working on his plantation. Oh, okay, I'm trying to read this. This is his quote. I ain't going for to spend money on that old nigger unless you cure her and make her able to work and pay for the money that's been done laid out for her. If she be going to die, why let her do it the cheapest way? And that is a quote from these super smart people. We're finishing up. Okay, we are finishing chapter 1 of the medical apartheid. This is called the owner-physician pact. Southern physicians supported the slave system with racial medical theories and diagnosis, but the slave system also supported them. In an era when physicians enjoyed considerably fewer financial rewards and lower professional status than they do today, these physicians derived most of their income from caring for slaves. As Samuel Cartwright observed in 1853, the most profitable kind of practice is among Negroes. Slavery created a medical partnership with physician and planter that eclipsed the patient-physician died, the traditional Western healing relationship. In the slave-holding United States, where the planter owned the slave and employed the physician, owners made their complaints or treatment wishes known to physicians and gave or withheld consent for procedures from sterilization to amputation to autopsy. The planter, not the slave, had to be satisfied with the results. The planter, in every important sense of the word, was the patient. The Southern relationship was a slaveholder-physician diet, with the slave left outside, unconsulted, uninformed, and with no recourse if she or he was unsatisfied, injured, or killed in a medical nonentity. Physicians were often slaveholders themselves. In fact, in 1847, State Medical Convention in Alabama issued a reconnection that doctors caring for slaves seek liens upon the human cattle if their bills were not paid. Slave-owning physicians profited from their slaves in the usual ways: fieldwork, housework, concubines, rented labor, and breeders of slaves. However, doctors also bought and hired slaves on whom to conduct experiments too painful, too risky, and otherwise too objectable to inflict upon whites. I will examine many instances of this practice in the pages that follow. The matter of life insurance also eliminates the medical conflict of slave's health and his master's economic interest in his soundness. Although most Southern gentlemen found the prospect of insurance coverage for land-owning whites and their families of distasteful parallel to insuring equipment and livestock, the practice of insuring slaves' lives escalated into 1840s. In 1858, 75% of the North Carolina manual life insurance companies' policies were written on slaves. 75% of mutual life insurance company policies were written on slaves in 1858. But despite owners' assurance that slaves were like members of their families, insurers' research suggests that owners did not shy from maximizing the profit from their slaves, dead or alive. Even Dr. Joseph Knott, the famous defender of slavery, worried that rapish masters would allow sick or injured slaves to die without treatment. Warning: any man who will drive a horse cruelly will drive a Negro or operative to death, if he can gain anything by doing so. South Carolina and Virginia insurance companies eventually refused to insure a slave's life for full value for fear that owners would allow them to die of their ailments. Insurers also hedged their bets by requiring physical examination of slaves, by charging more for slaves placed in especially hazardous environments, and by requiring proof that the owner had the slave treated for medical conditions as they rose. Thus, companies that had likely taken heat for insuring slaves' lives also took steps that protected those lives. I spoke in my introduction of the term for the fear of medical cares that joins the Greek words for healer and fear. Black iotrophobia had a very long history, and one of the earliest signs during slavery was that when they were not accusing slaves of malingering, overseers, planters, and physicians claimed bitterly that slaves were concealing their illnesses. In this, they were often correct. Slaves avoided the ministry of Western doctors by denying that they were sick as long as they could, even to a point of working while they were ill, discouraged medications, and hiding their children's illnesses. This enraged the masters and physicians because they believed that blacks' failure to report illness and to accept whites' cures led to the premature death and the loss of valuable slaves. However, slaves distrusted Western remedies as ineffective and dangerous. They also complained that these treatments were stereotyped. The same remedies were often offered for various ailments. Mary Reynolds could list her physician owner's entire material medica, the common term for pharmaceutical supplies, for slaves in one breath. Dr. Kilpatrick gave sick niggers pedicat and asafoetide and oil and turpentine and black fever pills. Work Projects Administration interviewers quoted former slave Joe Hawkins as charging, "Doctors then didn't work as people like they do now. No, sir. He'd bleed you so many minutes while he was watching his big watch he always carried. Bleed you from most any sickness." Slaves knew that some of the treatments worsened problems, and perhaps most importantly, they realized that the master's interest in their fitness for work was sometimes admissible to their health. In short, enslaved blacks often eschewed Western medicine because they suspected their owners of the greater interest in them as capital than in their welfare. They also questioned the acuteness and the motivation of the regular Western physicians, who in turn ridiculed the spiritual component of African medicine as superstitious. Then, too, slaves had their own healers and preferred medicines that were less harsh and often more effective. Slave medicine, unlike the physician-based, almost mechanical ministries of whites, incorporated African healing philosophies and techniques, including strong philosophy, social, and spiritual components. Slaves themselves illustrated this by the parallels they drew between their medical treatment and that given the livestock. Former slave Richard Toller remembers that owners were as tackled with slaves as with the stock. That was their money, And if we claimed being sick, they give us a dose of castor oil and turpentine. That was the principal medicine colored folks had to take. And if we was real sick, they had the doctor come for us. Appeals to God, the importance of moral fitness, and enlisting the help of departed spirits, especially the intercession of ancestors, were all key to the African-based healing process. Ancestors who were angered by disrespect or neglect could cause illness, alienation, and other troubles for the living. This is one reason the respectful ritual treatment of the dead was so important to slaves, and why they reviled Western medicine when they discovered that physicians appropriated the bodies of dead slaves for display and discretion. Western medicine was thought ineffective against spirit-caused illness, and slaves often lacked confidence in a Western doctor's ability to cure them. If a doctor did not believe that one could be cursed or conjured, how could he remove the threat? This is a wide generalization because some slaves mistrusted African physicians who sometimes used their skills to harm as well as to heal. But in planters' farm books and in medical journals, physicians and slave owners repeatedly berated the ignorance and superstition that led slaves to conceal illness and to shrink their scientific Western medicine in favor of conjure women and witch doctors. However, whites had no monopoly on science. African tradition evolved philosophically as well as spiritual approaches to healing, including in encyclopedic knowledge of herbs, roots, and other natural medicines. This detailed knowledge was continuously passed down along lines of apprenticeship from wise women and male herbal doctors to gifted young members of the community. Despite their characterization as primitive, African healers first employed citrus juice for scurvy and inoculation for smallpox and other viral illnesses. Midwives used African techniques, herbs, and medicine so successfully without dangerous tools of the day, such as forceps, that many white women called them to attend births. Some whites were impressed by the success rate of Negro doctors and doctresses, consulted them, and placed their medical recipes in the family book. The Western doctors faced brisk competition from black herbal doctors. In a 1855 journal article, Dr. R.H. Whitfield of Alabama railed against unscientific midwives. There are known practices wherein which the female physician are less educated, being chiefly negrish and mulattoes or foreigners without anatomical, physical, or obstetrical education. That which uneducated persons should be generally successful in owing to the fact that in a great majority of cases, no scientific skill is required, and thus a lucky negress becomes the rival of the most learned obstetrician. For all their complaints, physicians in the early to mid-19th century were happy to leave the business of birthing in the hands of black midwives. However, physicians wanted black healers under the scrutiny and supervision of white physicians. White doctors designated black midwives and healers, calling them uneducated, but white physicians themselves usually had no academic preparation beyond the few months in medical school or a few years of apprenticeship, which many blacks also shared. So until the mid-1800s, such claims of superior education rang hollow. Also, regular medicine embraced no consistent curriculum, but wrote in a monotony association of disciplines. At the bedside, healers practiced a variety of Western fads such as hypotherapy, which utilized harmless but ineffective water cures for their ailments, and Thomason allowed by disciplines of New Hampshire farmer Samuel Thompson, who, like black healers, advocated the use of milder herb and vegetable remedies and medicines. The constant friction between white physicians and enslaved healers sometimes erupted into open hostility. Physicians denegated black medical practice and imposed punishment, including extortion, upon black healers on the pretext of protecting the larger community from poisoning and from the evil mechanicals and occults who doctors claim control the minds and actions of superstitious blacks. Black contribution to early American medicine included research. In fact, slave doctors sometimes developed medicines that were so highly praised as to garner them fame, fortune, and their freedom. In 1721, Lieutenant Something of Virginia authorized the payment of £60 to minute an unnamed Negro man. Gooch declared that his mixture of pharmacologically active roots and barks had proved an effective syphilis remedy. It is well worth the price of a Negro's freedom, wrote Gooch. Such it is known that how to cure Negroes without mercury. In 1751, a South Carolina slave doctor named Caesar developed several medical interventions, including an almost foolproof snake bite antidote. The cure featured a shrub called plantain and horrid hone, a plant that derived its name from Egyptian priests who called it the seed of Horus, the Egyptian god of the sun and virtue, mixed with sassafras, wood ashes, and Tabasco. On February 25th of that year, the South Carolina Gazette published the recipe as a public service, and demand ran so high that it was reprinted widely and published as a monogram in 1789. In 1799, it was mentioned in the text, Domestic Medicine. Caesar's medical acumen earned him his freedom from the South Carolina General Assembly, which also granted him an annual pension of £100. Primus was another slave who won fame for medical achievements, which include a rabies treatment. The medical care of benefited rather than suffered when the white physician to whom he was apprenticed upon turned out to be incompatible for alcoholism. Left to his own devices, Elf formulated new medicines which proved so effective that his patent drug became popular across the state. Meanwhile, Western doctors complained that overseers resorted to a standard remedy for every complaint, calamine oil. This chapter has sketched the roots of this friction between medical practitioners and African Americans. The next describes how medical experimentation heightened the aversion of black patients for white physicians. That's chapter 1.